the introduction that I have about TPN is just a brief introduction to share with you how we got to have TPN Credit Bureau Tenant Profile Network. And about 12, 13 years ago, I was working in Joburg as a property manager. I was renting out other landlords' properties, and I was frustrated with some of my delinquent tenants. And specifically, the pivotal point was my tenant, Mr. Chris, who is in number 12 Parklands in Noordwijk. And I was on my way through to number 12 Parklands to go and tell Mr. Chris that really his behavior was now becoming intolerable and he needed to vacate the property. Lucky for me, that's exactly what he was doing. He was vacating the property. The only problem was he was moving into number 13 next door. So him and his mates were carrying his furniture through the one door and into the next. And I thought to myself, thank God I'm not renting number 13, that's somebody else's problem, but how as an industry, how as a community do we talk to each other? How do we share the information that this has been my positive experience and this has been my delinquent tenant experience, rather not rent to this specific individual? Hence TPN. It's a database where we can now pull that information as landlords or as property managers. We can share information and we can pull information off that database, which means that Mr. Chris, God forbid he decides to move to Nelspruit, he's on that database and you won't pick him up. So how is favorable rental returns achieved? Because that as a landlord is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to ensure that we have a quality property with a quality tenant equal quality returns. And that's exactly what it's about. It's about putting in tenants who are best suited for your property. It's about having well-maintained properties, because a well-maintained property equals a quality tenant, which is going to equal for you quality payments. We see it so often. And in fact, I was just reading a story to some of the guys that was in the news today of an 82-year-old pensioner down in Durban who's just been sentenced to 10 years in jail, a landlord, because his tenants weren't paying the rent. He couldn't pay the utilities, and the pivotal point for him was, the tenant said to him, I'm not paying the rent until the bank forecloses on you. He whipped out his gun and shot the lady 4 times in the chest. 82-year-old pensioner. And this is exactly what we need to prevent. We need to say there are processes in place that you can manage your property, manage your tenant, and not end up in a scenario like this poor old pensioner. So well-maintained properties equals well-managed rent collections. And in order to have well-managed rent collections, you need the proper partners in place. If you can't manage the property on your own, hand it over to a specialist like Realty One, who can manage that property on your behalf. They have the right IT infrastructure to make that happen, with the right partners in terms of your collections to make that process run a lot more smoothly. So the elements of a quality tenant, and for me the first element is past behavior is going to determine future behavior. A leopard doesn't change his spots. So how the tenant behaves in the past is going to be very indicative as to how he's going to behave going forward. Affordability is key, and I think that's where a lot of property managers and landlords miss the boat. You've got to bring in your affordability component, because a tenant who has the ability to pay a 5,000 Rand rental could become quite stressed at a 6,500 Rand rental and is not going to be a quality tenant in that rental bracket. Incidentally, the national average for rental payment is about 4,600 Rand. Ilvat's going to speak a little bit more about how those rental increases have or have not been happening over the past couple of years. But from our perspective, we're not seeing increasing in rent at the moment. You know, where you could rely on, oh, I'm going to get my 10% increases going forward, not so much. The other thing that you need to take into account when it comes to affordability is not just the basic rental amount, it's the other additional costs that are associated to that. For example, your utility costs. The electricity component of rents has gone up substantially. And I'll give you an example of some of my landlords in the Joburg inner city, where the total value of what the tenant was paying, the electricity portion of that 3-4 years ago was about 12%. Now we're sitting where that electricity component, that electricity portion of the total rent is 60% of what the tenant is paying. Which again, indicative of the fact that the landlord has been unable to increase his rent because the overall cost of living for that tenant has gone up so significantly. The third thing about your tenant is his ability to pay versus his desire to pay. Such was the example of the lady in Durban who said to the landlord, I'm not going to pay till the bank forecloses. It wasn't that she didn't have the ability to pay. She did have the ability, she just wasn't prepared to pay. So the first thing is the tenant who has the means to pay and will pay versus the tenant who has the means to pay but won't pay. And lastly, the tenant who actually doesn't have the means. And those are usually your tenants who something's changed in their lifestyle. There's been a retrenchment in the family. The income coming in isn't as great as what it was. There's been emergency expenses that month, and therefore the tenant does not have the ability to meet the rental expenses. So some national trends, some information that we pull about how tenants make those monthly payments. And we're looking here at Q1 of 2012 data. All the tenants pulled together, rental ranges, we've got tenants staying in 400 Rand student rooms, right up to tenants spending 100,000 Rand on properties in Constantia. So we've got a wide range of tenants. We look across that whole database, and we've got 68% of tenants who are paid on time and in full. First of the month comes, first of the month, the money is in the bank, it's banked. The landlord can then confidently go about paying his bond repayments, his levy accounts, and all the other costs associated with the property. 13% of tenants are in the paid late category. Those are tenants who have paid, but it could be right up until the end of the month. The problem there is the landlord is going to have to fund the property expenses whilst waiting for the income to come in at a later date. 8% of tenants in the partial payment, and the problem here is the 11% of tenants in the did not pay category. So 1 in 10 tenants, you can expect no payment whatsoever. We've taken that a little bit further and we said how many of those tenants are in what we call a squatter state. A squatter state is a tenant who hasn't necessarily gone through the whole eviction, the legal eviction process, but he's 4 months behind on his rent. Did not pay categories 4 months in a row. 1.67% of tenants are sitting in the squatter scenario. We then looked at the data and we said, well, let's try and identify the different rental brackets. You've got tenants who are paying less than 3,000 Rand a month. You've got tenants between the 3 and the 7,000 Rand rental bracket. And as I said, the national average at the moment from our perspective sits at 4,600 Rand. I know from Hanu's perspective it sits at about 5,500 Rand. So you've got the 3,000 to 7,000 category, the 7,000 to 12,000 category, and the 12,000 plus. Here's the problem with the below 3,000 Rand category. 19% of tenants are in the did not pay sector. That's 1 in 5 tenants are not going to pay their rent at all versus the national average of 11. 1 in 10 tenants not paying. Here, cause and effect, we've got inflationary price increases that are eating away, eroding their income. So the utility costs, the petrol price costs, the fuel costs, the food inflation, those are all costs that are making his ability to meet his rental payment now quite tight. The 12,000 plus, and those tenants have owned the space of worst tenant behavior for the last 9 months, so for the last 3 quarters. Prior to that, it was the tenants in the above 12,000 Rand category. And you'll see they're not doing so well. You're sitting with about a 17% paid late category, but they're not deteriorating further at the moment. They're quite stable, although not performing very well, they are quite stable. Cause and effect here. Cause and effect here, we're seeing that the interest rates play quite a significant role in this type of tenant. So when interest rates start to go up, it starts to make their affordability a lot tighter, and we start to see a deterioration in rental payments. And there's about a 9-month lag. So watch that space. It means that when placing tenants now in that category, affordability is critical. We've got to factor in that when interest rates go up, it's going to eat away in their affordability. The third thing that I just want to share with you is about how our tenant trends relate to the traditional credit trends. Because we're not tenants in isolation. We have other credit facilities as tenants. And so it's very important to understand how we behave in terms of our traditional credit when identifying how we're going to behave in terms of tenant behavior. So down here in 2012, we're sitting at an 81% tenants in good standing. Those are our tenants in the paid on time category, 68%, and our tenants in the paid late category, 13%. That gives us a good standing of 81%, previous quarter 81% as well, versus 53% of consumers are considered to be in good standing in terms of their credit. Effectively, that means 1 in 2 consumers have impaired credit records, which feeds in nicely to the Better Bond presentation telling us that only 50% of applications are being approved. The banks can only approve on what there is to lend to, and Ewald will give us more information on that, I know, in his presentation. Some interesting information on the overall market. We've got 14.3 million households in South Africa. Of those 14.3 million, we've got 11 million in the formal sector, so that's the sector I'm going to talk about now. And in terms of the actual rented properties, 2.9 million households are in rented accommodation. In the formal sector, that's 2.2 million. That's our market. Those are people who are in the buy-to-let space. Investors who have bought properties, and we are now renting those out to tenanted accommodation. 2.2 million in the formal sector. Interestingly, in the house, in a brick structure, in a stand with a brick structure, we've got 1 million properties. Then takes us down to about 500,000 in flats, 40,000 in clusters, 85,000 in townhouses. So now we're starting to get an idea of what type of property we should be investing in, what rental bracket we should be thinking about when we're making that investment choice. Probably not a good idea to go into the low sector, low income sector, or the low rental value sector. Probably not going to be as a good investment in the above 12,000, but sitting yourself between the 3,000 and the 7, or the 7 and the 12,000 rand rented bracket, those are the good investment properties then to be looking at as an investor. And my last one, just from a province perspective, here in Mpumalanga, 156,000 households in rented accommodation. That's significant. That's a big part of the market that is sitting in rented accommodation, and as investors we have the opportunity then to ensure that we have property supply and demand. Again, Ewald will speak a little bit more about that. When we looked at the type of investors there are out there, there are just a small handful of institutional investors in the residential market. Commercial is something different, but in the residential we have the likes of City Properties that have 16,500 properties on their books in Pretoria. In the Joburg inner city, we've got about 14 to 18 landlords that collectively sit with about 40 to 50,000 units in the inner city. And when you take that and you say, but the market is 2.2 million in the formal sector, and I'm taking 16,000 here and 40 or 50,000 units there, who has all of these investment properties? Who are our investors? And 75% of our landlords are what we call micro-investors. They're investors between 1 and 10 properties on their portfolios. So it's guys that are using property as an investment tool, as wealth creation, to say, well, I'd like to supplement my income, I'd like to have a pension down the line, and I'm going to use property to drive that. When we looked at the deeds data, we only found that there was less than 100, it was 85 investors, commercial or individual landlords, who had more than 100 properties. Now, when I talk about properties, I'm saying one property could be a building with 100 units in it. So it's not one tenanted property, it's 100 properties. So there's quite the market is driven at the moment by small investors, and we've got to make sure that we are looking after the needs of that small investor, because his needs are different to the institutional guys. In closing then, I just want to talk about the risk factors as we're seeing them at the moment, because by identifying what the risk factors are, we can then position ourselves to say, well, we have solutions to combat those risks, which is exactly what today's presentation is about. It's about pooling information and saying, okay, well, how do we create a solution that we can then take to marketplace? A big problem at the moment is deposit used as last month's rent. Tenants who say, you know what, I'm not going to pay my last month's rent, just use my deposit. There are a couple of factors that play into that. Factor number one is, more than likely, he's using that last month's rent to place his deposit on his new property. The problem for the investor is the tenant vacates the property, there could be damages. 9 times out of 10, there's going to be an outstanding utility account, and it now becomes a problem to try and collect those outstanding costs. So deposit used as a last month's rent is a problem in the industry, combated by double deposit taken up front. Application to rent in a spouse's name. This is not new. Tenants who hide behind hubby or hide behind wife and say, you know what, do it in my husband's name, do it in my wife's name. They're trying to protect, or they're trying to hide their negative delinquent tenant behavior in the past. It is absolutely critical that credit checks are performed on both the husband and wife, on the co-tenants entering into the agreement. But even worse than that, we're starting to see a trend of moms and dads putting leases into their kids' names. 21-year-old, 22-year-old son or daughter, and leases are being put into the names of the children because mom and dad now are trying to protect their delinquent behavior. Delinquent tenants are now specifically targeting landlords. And this is because property managers now have the right tools in place to make a qualified decision on the type of tenant that they're going to place. So as soon as a tenant who has delinquent behavior comes into a property manager's office and sees the process that the property manager is going to follow in terms of placement, those delinquent tenants are saying, you know what, I'd rather go to a private landlord where those processes aren't in place, and it's more likely that I can manipulate a private landlord into giving me access to his property. The negotiation of the handover of keys before proof of payment has hit the bank account. Big problem. Big problem with tenants gaining access into. I'll give you a prime story. We had a tenant, a landlord in Primrose. He had shown the property, and again, tenants are manipulative. They play on your emotions. A woman had come in, 2 little kids in hand, liked to look at a property. They had a look at the property. They said, it's perfect. My husband's going to be coming back from overseas in a couple of days. I'd like to bring him in to show him the property as well. 7 o'clock on a Saturday night, she phoned him up. She said, right, my husband's just landed. I'd actually like to show him the property, but I know it's late. It's a Saturday night. Why don't you give me the keys? I'll pick them up from your house. I'll show my husband, and I'll come drop the keys back off. No keys arrived. Sunday morning, he went to the property, and in she had moved. No lease, no credit checks, no rent, no deposit, no husband, but 2 kids. And she says, and I know my rights. You will have to evict me, and you will have to go through a prior process, and I'm not moving. And he thought, oh, you know, I know better. I'm going to move her furniture onto the road. I'm going to lock her out, and that's going to be how I'm going to address the situation. She took him to the High Court and got a spoliation order on the Monday, and she was moved back into the property by the courts, who said, if you want her out, there's an eviction process that you must follow, and you will have to go through that process. So tenants are manipulative, and they know how the system works. And it's up to us to say, well, we also have the right tools in place. We know the processes that we need to follow, and we need to protect ourselves, and we need to protect our investors. And the last one that we're seeing is fraudulent supporting documentation. ID documents of people that don't exist. Proof of payments. So a lot of tenants are saying, here's my proof of payment, hand the keys over, and the money doesn't hit the account 2 or 3 days later. The problem is the tenant is now in the property. No deposit, no upfront rental payment. And again, there's a process to get the tenant out, but it is going to be a 3-month process. Property is a fabulous investment. It's a wonderful investment. There are wonderful opportunities out there for private landlords, but it's important that we have the right processes in place, the right partners in place that can guide us through making sure our investment actually turns into something that generates wealth for us. Thank you very much.